Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Homecoming. Connor McKenzie pulled his black SUV into the driveway of his suburban Virginia home, the engine's rumble fading into an unsettling silence. After 3 weeks in Eastern Europe eliminating a weapons trafficking network, all he wanted was to hold his wife Julia and hear about his twins' latest soccer victories. The mission had been particularly brutal, even by his standards, and the familiar sight of his white colonial house usually brought him peace. But something was wrong. The lawn was overgrown, newspapers scattered across the porch, and Julia's car was missing from its usual spot. Connor's hand instinctively moved to the Sig Sauer P226 concealed beneath his jacket as he approached the front door. 15 years of black operations had taught him to trust his instincts, and every nerve in his body was screaming danger. The house key turned too easily. The deadbolt wasn't engaged. Inside, the silence was deafening. No sounds of teenage laughter from his 16-year-old twins, Tyler and Madison. No classical music that Julia always played while grading her students' papers. The air tasted stale, abandoned. "Julia," Connor called out, his voice echoing through empty rooms. "Tyler." "Madison." He moved through the house systematically, clearing each room with military precision. The master bedroom showed signs of hasty packing. Dresser drawers pulled open, Julia's jewelry box empty, her favorite clothes gone. But it wasn't random. Someone had been selective, taking only specific items. In the twins' rooms, the story was the same. Their phones, laptops, and personal items were missing, but their sports equipment and school projects remained untouched. This wasn't a kidnapping. This was an evacuation. A knock at the front door made Connor's blood run cold. Through the peephole, he saw Mrs. Henderson, his elderly neighbor, wringing her hands nervously. She'd been living next door for 30 years and had watched the twins grow up. "Oh, Connor, thank God you're back," she said when he opened the door. Her voice trembled as she handed him a sealed envelope. "Some men came by 3 days ago. Official-looking types in dark suits. They said they were from your work." Julia seemed to know them. "She left with the children willingly, but she asked me to give you this." Connor's fingers closed around the envelope, his jaw clenching. What did these men look like? Professional. One had a scar across his chin, spoke with a slight accent I couldn't place. Another was younger, very handsome, seemed familiar with Julia. Mrs. Henderson's eyes showed the discomfort of sharing unwelcome information. "I'm sorry, Connor. Julia seemed different these past few months. Distant. She stopped our usual coffee talks." After Mrs. Henderson left, Connor tore open the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper with Julia's handwriting. "Connor, by the time you read this, we'll be somewhere safe. The children and I have been living in fear, knowing what you really do, what you're capable of. We can't pretend anymore. We deserve better than a life built on violence and lies. Don't try to find us. J." Connor read the letter 3 times, each word cutting deeper than any blade he'd ever faced in combat. But it was what wasn't said that troubled him most. Julia knew the nature of his work when they married. She'd accepted it, even supported it. Something had changed, and he needed to know what. He pulled out his encrypted satellite phone and dialed his handler at Langley. "Raptor, this is Base. You're early for check-in," came the familiar voice of Director Richard Lawson. "Sir, we have a problem," Connor said, scanning the empty street through his living room window. "My family's been compromised. Julia and the twins are gone. Someone claiming to be from the agency took them 3 days ago." The line went quiet for several long seconds. When Lawson spoke again, his voice had changed, becoming carefully neutral. "Connor, I need you to listen carefully. Your wife is." The line went dead. Connor stared at the phone, ice forming in his veins. In 15 years of operations, communications had never been cut during a crisis call. Never. He tried calling back, but the number was disconnected. Red laser dots suddenly appeared on his chest, dancing across his black tactical shirt like deadly fireflies. 3 of them, perfectly positioned for a kill shot. Connor dove behind the couch as the living room windows exploded inward, showering glass across the hardwood floor. "Connor McKenzie," a voice shouted from outside, heavily accented. Russian, he thought. "We know you're in there. Come out with your hands visible." Through the chaos, Connor's mind raced. This wasn't random. The timing was too perfect, the coordination too precise. Someone had waited for him to discover his family's disappearance, waited for him to make that call to Langley. They'd been watching, planning. As he low-crawled toward the kitchen where he kept the emergency weapons cache, one terrible thought crystallized in his mind. Julia's letter hadn't been written under duress. She'd known this was coming. Chapter 2. Ghosts from the Past. Connor slipped through the basement window as tactical teams surrounded his house. Years of escape and evasion training kicked in automatically as he moved through the neighbor's yard, staying low and using the pre-dawn darkness as cover. The attackers were professionals, but they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd assumed he'd fight rather than flee. His mind was already analyzing the situation as he reached his emergency vehicle, a nondescript Honda Civic parked 6 blocks away with fake plates and a clean identity packet. The accent of the man shouting orders nagged at him. Russian, definitely, but with educated overtones. Someone from the intelligence community, not street muscle. As Connor drove through the empty Virginia streets, pieces of a larger puzzle began forming. Julia's behavior over the past 6 months suddenly made sense. The late-night phone calls she'd claimed were work-related, her sudden interest in his mission schedules, the way she'd started asking detailed questions about his operations. He needed information, and there was only one person who might have answers: Viktor Kozlov, a former Spetsnaz operative turned freelance intelligence broker. Connor had worked with Viktor on several off-the-books operations, building a relationship based on mutual respect and shared brutality. If anyone knew what was happening in the shadow world, it would be Viktor. The meeting was set for dawn at an abandoned warehouse in Baltimore. Viktor was already waiting when Connor arrived, his massive frame silhouetted against the rising sun. At 55, the Russian bore scars from conflicts across 3 decades, but his pale blue eyes remained sharp as surgical steel. "You look like shit, my friend," Viktor said in his heavily accented English, offering Connor a cigarette. "I heard about the fireworks at your house this morning. Radio chatter suggests you've made some very serious enemies." "Tell me something I don't know," Connor replied, declining the cigarette. "Who's got my family, Viktor?" Viktor's expression grew serious. "That's a complicated question. You remember Alexei Volkov?" Connor's blood chilled. Alexei Volkov, the target of his most recent operation in Prague, supposedly eliminated along with his entire cell. "Volkov's dead. I put 3 rounds in his chest myself. Perhaps. Or perhaps you killed his body double while real Volkov escaped." Viktor pulled out a tablet, showing surveillance photos. "These were taken yesterday in Montreal. Volkov is very much alive and very angry about destruction of his operation." The photos showed a man Connor had indeed killed, or thought he had. Same facial structure, same build, but subtle differences in the eyes, the way he carried himself. "Son of a bitch," Connor muttered. "Gets worse," Viktor continued. "Volkov has been planning revenge for months. He's been studying you, learning about your family, your routines. But here's interesting part. He had help from inside." Viktor swiped to another photo, and Connor's world tilted on its axis. It showed Julia sitting across from a younger man in an upscale restaurant, their hands intertwined across the table. The man was devastatingly handsome, with dark hair and the kind of smile that probably made women forget their own names. "Meet Dr. Andrew Morrison," Viktor said. "Clinical psychologist, specializes in trauma therapy for military families. Also, turns out, Volkov's nephew and sleeper agent. He's been working Julia for 8 months, using classic honey trap techniques." Connor stared at the photo, his hands clenching into fists. "How long have you known?" "I discovered connection 2 weeks ago, but you were already in Prague. I tried to warn Langley, but..." Viktor shrugged. "Someone there is also compromised. Your handler, Lawson, has been feeding information to Volkov's network." The betrayal hit Connor like a physical blow. Lawson had been his mentor for over a decade, the man who'd recruited him straight out of Army Special Forces. "You're sure about this?" "The Lawson has been taking money from Volkov for 3 years. Your Prague mission was supposed to be your death sentence. Volkov wanted personal revenge for killing his brother in Syria. When you survived and eliminated what he thought was Volkov himself, they had to accelerate their timeline." Connor absorbed this information, his analytical mind already forming a response strategy. "Where are they now?" "Julia and children are at Morrison's cabin in the Adirondacks. They think they're safe, think this is some romantic escape from your dangerous lifestyle." Victor's voice carried disgust. Julia has no idea Morrison is Volkov's nephew. No idea she's been played. She believes she's protecting your children from your work, but she's actually delivered them directly to your greatest enemy. And Volkov, moving to join them tomorrow. The plan is to make your family disappear permanently, then leak evidence that you went rogue and killed them yourself before vanishing. Your reputation destroyed, your legacy erased. Connor stood in silence for several minutes, processing the scale of the betrayal. His wife, his handler, his own family, all turned against him through manipulation and lies. But beneath the pain, something else was growing, a cold, methodical fury that had made him legendary in the black operations community. "Victor," he said finally, his voice carrying a tone the Russian recognized from their darkest missions together. "I'm going to need equipment, and I'm going to need you to disappear any evidence we had this conversation." Victor smiled grimly. "What kind of equipment?" "The kind that makes people who betray me very, very sorry they were ever born." As they began planning, Connor felt the last vestiges of the man who'd believed in family, love, and loyalty dying inside him. What emerged was something far more dangerous, a predator with nothing left to lose and every skill necessary to make his enemies pay in blood. Chapter 3: The Hunter Awakens. 2 hours later, Connor sat in the back of Victor's modified van, transforming himself from grieving husband into apex predator. The equipment spread before him represented millions in black market military hardware, ceramic body armor, night vision optics, specialized weapons, and electronic surveillance gear that officially didn't exist. But the most important tool was the intelligence Victor had gathered. Photos, floor plans, communication intercepts, and psychological profiles of every player in Volkov's network. Connor studied each detail with the intensity of a monk reading scripture, memorizing faces, habits, weaknesses. "Morrison has been very careful," Victor explained, pointing to surveillance photos of the psychologist. "Clean background, legitimate practice, even published papers on military family trauma. Perfect cover identity. But I found something interesting in his personal life." Victor handed Connor a file folder. Inside were financial records showing substantial gambling debts to some very unpleasant people. "Dr. Morrison owes $2 million to Russian mob in Brighton Beach. Convenient motivation for cooperating with Uncle Volkov." Connor smiled coldly. "Debts could be transferred. Creditors could be reasoned with, especially when the conversation involved loaded weapons and intimate knowledge of their business operations." "What about my children?" Connor asked, the only crack in his otherwise emotionless facade. Victor's expression softened slightly. "From intercepts, they believe they're on family vacation. Morrison has been very charming, playing the concerned family friend helping them escape their father's dangerous work. Tyler and Madison have no idea what's really happening. And Julia? She's convinced Morrison is her salvation. The psychologist has been very skilled in his manipulation, making her feel heard, understood, valued. Classic tactics." Victor paused. "There's something else. Morrison has been recording their intimate moments. Insurance, he calls it. Volkov wants complete psychological destruction before physical elimination." Connor's hands stilled on the weapon he'd been cleaning. When he looked up, Victor involuntarily stepped back. He'd seen that expression before, on targets just before Connor eliminated them. "I need you to make contact with Morrison's creditors," Connor said quietly. "I want to buy his debt. All of it. That's expensive proposition. I'll transfer the funds from my Swiss accounts. Every penny if necessary." Connor began methodically loading magazines with hollow point rounds. "Then I need you to arrange a meeting with Lawson. Somewhere private." "Connor, my friend, I understand your anger, but Lawson is surrounded by CIA security. Not when he's visiting his son at Georgetown University tomorrow night. Jimmy Lawson, sophomore pre-med student, apartment on N Street. Lawson visits every Thursday at 8 p.m. sharp. Been doing it for 2 years." Connor's voice carried the certainty of someone who'd made survival a science. "I've been watching Lawson's patterns for years, Victor. Habit of working with people whose routines I understand completely." Victor nodded slowly, recognizing the methodical precision that made Connor so effective. "And after you handle Lawson? Then I pay a visit to the happy family in the Adirondacks." Connor stood, testing the weight of a tactical knife. "But first, they're going to learn what happens when someone tries to destroy Connor Mackenzie." As night fell, Connor began his hunt. The first stop was a high-end apartment building in Georgetown, where director Richard Lawson was just arriving for his weekly dinner with his son. Connor had spent years studying the man who'd become his surrogate father figure, learning his routines, his weaknesses, his pressure points. Lawson's betrayal cut deeper than Julia's because it was calculated, mercenary. Julia had been manipulated by a master psychologist during a vulnerable period. Lawson had simply been bought. Connor waited in the parking garage, watching Lawson emerge from his armored sedan. The director looked older than his 58 years, stress lines carved deep around his eyes. Perhaps the weight of betrayal was heavier than Lawson had anticipated. "Hello, Richard," Connor said, stepping from the shadows with his sidearm drawn but not directly aimed. "We need to talk." Lawson spun around, his hand moving toward his concealed weapon before recognizing Connor's voice. "Jesus Christ, Connor. What the hell are you doing here?" "Learning the truth about my family's disappearance. About why my handler cut communications during a crisis call. About why Russian operatives were waiting at my house." Connor moved closer, his voice carrying deadly calm. "About why the man I trusted with my life decided to sell me to my enemies." Lawson's face crumbled, the weight of his betrayal finally showing. "It's not what you think. It's exactly what I think. Volkov bought you. 3 years of payments. Victor showed me the transfers. You fed him my mission schedules, my family's routines, everything he needed to plan my destruction." Connor raised his weapon slightly. "The question is whether you did it for money or because they have something on you." "Both," Lawson whispered, defeat clear in his voice. "They found out about the operation in Somalia, Connor. The civilians who died in that village. If that becomes public, it destroys everything. Your career, my career, the entire program." Connor's expression didn't change. "Those civilians were enemy combatants using human shields. We followed rules of engagement. The media won't see it that way. Neither will Congress." Lawson looked broken, aged a decade in seconds. "Volkov offered me a choice. Cooperate or watch everything we've built burn. So you chose to sacrifice my family instead." Connor's voice remained perfectly level, but his eyes had become those of a predator evaluating prey. "Where are they, Richard?" "Connor, listen to me. Volkov isn't just after revenge. He wants to rebuild his brother's operation using your reputation. Having the legendary Connor McKenzie's family under his control gives him credibility in certain circles. He needs them alive." "That's not what I asked." Connor's finger moved to the trigger guard. "Where are they?" Lawson gave him the address, along with security details and Volkov's timeline. As Connor prepared to leave, Lawson grabbed his arm. "Connor, what happened in that village? We were soldiers following orders. But what you're planning now, this revenge." Connor looked down at the hand on his arm, then back at Lawson's face. "The difference is that my family never signed up to be soldiers. They were supposed to be protected by men they trusted." He pulled free from Lawson's grip. That protection failed. Now they get something else entirely. As Connor disappeared into the night, Lawson slumped against his car, knowing he'd just witnessed the transformation of a protector into something far more dangerous. And despite everything, he almost felt sorry for the people who had awakened this particular monster. Chapter 4: Sins of the Father. The drive to the Adirondacks took Connor through 6 hours of darkness and introspection. He'd learned long ago to compartmentalize emotion during operations, but this mission challenged even his legendary self-control. Every mile brought him closer to confronting not just external enemies, but the ruins of everything he'd believed about his life. Victor had provided real-time intelligence through encrypted channels. Morrison's cabin was isolated on a private lake, accessible only by a single mountain road. Volkov had arrived that evening with a 4-man security team, transforming what Julia believed was a romantic retreat into a death trap. Connor parked 3 miles from the cabin and moved through the forest on foot, his night vision gear turning the moonless woods into a green-tinted battlefield. He'd spent a decade perfecting the art of silent movement, and now those skills served a deeply personal mission. The cabin sat on a bluff overlooking the lake, its warm lights creating an illusion of safety and domesticity. Through his scope, Connor could see into the main room where his family sat around a stone fireplace. Tyler and Madison appeared relaxed, even happy. Morrison had clearly been working hard to win their trust. Julia sat close to the psychologist, her body language showing an intimacy that made Connor's jaw clench. But it was the positioning of Volkov's men that told the real story. They weren't protecting the cabin's occupants. They were guarding prisoners who didn't yet know their status. Connor spent 2 hours conducting surveillance, mapping guard rotations, identifying weapons caches, and locating weak points in the security perimeter. Volkov had been thorough but predictable, relying on the isolation of the location rather than overwhelming force. At 0200 hours, Connor began his approach. The first sentry died without making a sound, Connor's blade finding the precise spot between vertebrae that guaranteed instant death. The body was dragged into the underbrush and positioned to maintain the illusion of an active patrol. The second guard was monitoring approaches from the lake, his attention focused outward rather than on the forest behind him. Connor's suppressed pistol made no more noise than a cork popping from a wine bottle. 2 down. Inside the cabin, Connor could hear conversation from the main room. Through the kitchen window, he watched Morrison pouring wine for Julia, while Volkov sat in a corner chair, studying his prisoners with cold calculation. The remaining 2 guards flanked the exits, professional but relaxed. Connor attached a small explosive device to the cabin's electrical panel, then moved to his final position near the front door. When he triggered the charge, the lights went out and emergency protocols kicked in, exactly as he'd planned. In the confusion of darkness and shouting voices, Connor entered through the kitchen door. The infrared scope on his weapon turned the chaos into a target-rich environment. Guard 3 went down with a headshot before he could raise his rifle. Guard 4 managed to fire twice into empty darkness before Connor's rounds found their mark. Nobody moved. Connor's voice cut through the panic like a blade. Motion sensor on my rifle reads heartbeat and body heat. Any sudden movement results in immediate death. Emergency lighting flickered on, revealing Connor standing in tactical gear that made him look like death incarnate. His family stared in shock and terror, unable to reconcile this cold predator with the husband and father they thought they knew. Connor, Julia's voice was barely a whisper. How did you find us? The question isn't how I found you, Connor replied, his weapon trained on Morrison. The question is why you ran away with a man whose real name is Alexei Morrison, nephew of the war criminal I was sent to eliminate in Prague. Morrison's handsome face crumbled. Julia, I can explain. No need, Connor interrupted. I already know about your gambling debts, your recruitment by Uncle Alexei, your psychological manipulation of my wife during her most vulnerable moments. He moved closer, his voice dropping to a conversational tone. What I'm curious about is whether Julia knew she was being played, or if she's genuinely this stupid. Dad, what's happening? Madison's voice broke, 16 years of trust crashing into this new reality. Connor's expression softened slightly as he looked at his daughter. What's happening, sweetheart? Is that you're learning the difference between the world you thought existed and the world that actually does exist. Volkov had remained silent during the violence, studying Connor with professional interest. Now he spoke, his accent thick but his English precise. Very impressive, Mr. Mackenzie. But you misunderstand situation. Your family came here willingly. They wanted to escape from you. Because they were lied to, Connor replied. By you. By Morrison. By people who convinced them I was the monster in their story. He gestured with his weapon toward Morrison. Tell them the truth, doctor. Tell them about the cameras you installed in their hotel rooms. Tell them about the recordings you've been making for your uncle's entertainment. Julia's face went white. Andrew, what is he talking about? Morrison looked trapped, his carefully constructed persona crumbling under Connor's relentless pressure. Julia, you have to understand, I never meant for. Show her. Connor commanded, producing a tablet Victor had provided. Show her the surveillance footage from your bedroom yesterday morning. The color drained from Julia's face as she watched herself in intimate moments she believed were private. Morrison had been recording everything, creating compromat for later use. Her betrayal had been orchestrated, manipulated, recorded for posterity. You son of a bitch, Tyler snarled, moving toward Morrison before Connor's sharp command stopped him. Tyler, Madison, go to the kitchen. Now. Connor's voice carried absolute authority. What happens next isn't for you to see. As his children reluctantly moved away, Connor turned his attention to Volkov. You made this personal when you involved my family. Now you're going to learn why that was a mistake. What followed was a masterclass in psychological warfare as Connor systematically dismantled both Morrison and Volkov, using their own methods against them. The audio recordings of their planning sessions, the financial transactions Victor had intercepted, the detailed evidence of their network's activities. But most devastating was Connor's revelation of Morrison's true debts, not just to Russian criminals, but to people whose money he'd stolen from his patients' therapy trust funds. Professional ruin, criminal charges, and very angry men who viewed theft as a capital offense. "Congratulations, Doctor," Connor said with cold precision. "You've traded a comfortable life manipulating vulnerable people for a very short, very unpleasant future disappointing some extremely dangerous individuals." As dawn broke over the lake, Connor had everything he needed: confessions, evidence, and most importantly, the truth his family needed to understand their situation. The people who'd tried to destroy his life lay broken and defeated, facing consequences far worse than anything he could have devised. But the hardest conversation still lay ahead. Chapter 5: The Price of Truth. With Volkov and Morrison secured with military-grade restraints, Connor finally turned his full attention to his family. The silence in the cabin was deafening, broken only by the distant sound of sirens. Connor had called in federal authorities using Volkov's own communication equipment. Julia sat on the couch, her face a mask of shock and shame. The woman who'd written him that letter about deserving better than a life of violence and lies now understood that she'd been manipulated into becoming part of a far more sinister deception. "I need you to understand something," Connor said, removing his tactical vest, but keeping his sidearm visible. "Everything Morrison told you about my work, about the danger to our family, it was true. The difference is that he wasn't trying to protect you from it. He was trying to deliver you to it." "Connor, I'm so sorry," Julia began, tears streaming down her face. You thought I was the monster in our story," Connor interrupted. "You thought our marriage was built on lies and violence. And you know what? You were partially right." Tyler and Madison emerged from the kitchen, their teenage worldview shattered by the night's revelations. Connor studied his children's faces, seeing fear, confusion, and something else, disappointment in their mother's choices. "Dad," Tyler said carefully, "is it true what that man said? About what you do for work?" Connor nodded slowly. "Yes. I eliminate threats to American interests that can't be handled through conventional means. I've killed people, many people, in service to our country's security." Madison's voice was small, almost childlike. "Are you a bad person?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Connor considered his answer carefully, knowing that his children's entire understanding of morality hung in the balance. "I'm a person who does bad things to protect good people," he said finally, "including both of you. Every mission I've completed, every target I've eliminated, was chosen because they posed a threat to innocence, to families like ours." "But Mom said," Madison started. "Your mother was fed carefully crafted lies by a professional manipulator," Connor replied. "Dr. Morrison spent 8 months studying her psychological profile, identifying her fears and insecurities, then exploiting them systematically. She never had a chance." Volkov laughed from his restraints, the sound harsh and mocking. "Such touching family reunion. But you forget something, Mackenzie. Your wife chose to believe those lies because part of her wanted them to be true. She wanted excuse to leave you." Connor's expression didn't change, but his voice dropped to a whisper. "Keep talking, Alexei. Please. You think she was innocent victim? She was tired of living with killer, tired of explaining your absences, tired of lying to friends about your work. Morrison gave her justification for feelings she already had." Julia's face crumpled. "That's not true. I love Connor, I've always." "Have you?" Connor asked quietly. "Because the letter you left suggested otherwise. The letter that mentioned my violence and lies suggested a woman who'd been thinking about this for a long time." The silence stretched between them, heavy with years of unspoken resentment and fear. Finally, Julia spoke, her voice barely audible. "I was scared, Connor. Scared of what you do, scared of what it might mean for the children. When Andrew started explaining how your work was affecting us psychologically, how it was damaging our family structure." She trailed off, unable to meet his eyes. "So you decided to take my children and disappear rather than talk to me about your concerns." Connor's voice remained level, but ice was forming around the edges. You decided to trust a stranger over your husband of 18 years. I thought I was protecting them from their father. Connor let that statement hang in the air. You thought their father was such a danger to them that you needed to help them disappear. Tyler stepped forward, his voice sharp with teenage anger. Mom, why didn't you just ask Dad to quit? Why didn't you try to work it out instead of just running away? Madison nodded agreement. We could have figured something out as a family. Instead, you made us accessories to this betrayal. Connor watched the exchange with growing coldness. His children were defending him while his wife had been prepared to sacrifice their family to escape her fears. The woman he'd loved and trusted had chosen to believe the worst about him rather than give him a chance to address her concerns. Connor, Julia pleaded, you have to understand. I understand perfectly, Connor replied. You understand that I will never trust you again. You understand that I will never forgive this betrayal. And you understand that while I won't harm you, you're the mother of my children. I will never allow you to have the opportunity to betray us again. The federal vehicles were arriving outside, their lights painting the cabin walls in rotating colors of red and blue. Connor had orchestrated this entire scene to ensure official documentation of Volkov's network and Morrison's crimes, but also to create an official record of his family's manipulation and near abduction. As FBI agents secured the scene and took statements, Connor pulled his children aside. I need you both to understand something. Your mother made her choice based on fear and manipulation, but she made it nonetheless. I will always love you, always protect you, but things can never go back to the way they were. What does that mean? Madison asked. It means that trust, once broken, is nearly impossible to repair. It means that some betrayals are unforgivable, even when they come from people we love. Connor looked toward Julia, who was giving her statement to federal agents. It means that your father is going to make sure something like this never happens again. Tyler, mature beyond his 16 years, nodded slowly. What about Mom? Connor's expression became unreadable. Your mother will learn that there are consequences for every choice we make. And some consequences last forever. As dawn fully broke over the lake, Connor began planning the next phase of his campaign. Volkov and Morrison would face federal prosecution, but that was just the beginning. There were debts to be collected, reputations to be destroyed, and lessons to be taught about the price of betraying Connor McKenzie. But first, he had to decide what to do about the woman who'd given his enemies everything they needed to destroy his family. Chapter 6. The Reckoning. 3 weeks later, Connor sat in a federal courthouse watching Alexei Volkov receive a life sentence for terrorism, kidnapping, and conspiracy charges. Morrison had already pleaded guilty to multiple felonies in exchange for protective custody. His former gambling creditors had made it clear that his life expectancy outside federal prison was measured in hours. But Connor's real work had been happening behind the scenes, in the shadows where he'd always operated most effectively. Using his extensive network of contacts and his knowledge of how to manipulate financial systems, he'd been systematically dismantling every aspect of his enemies' lives. Morrison's psychology practice had been destroyed when Connor anonymously leaked evidence of the trust fund thefts to medical boards and former patients. His professional reputation was in ruins, his license revoked, his future destroyed even if he survived prison. The man who tried to psychologically manipulate Connor's family had been psychologically destroyed in return. Volkov's network had been rolled up completely, with Connor providing intelligence to multiple international agencies. Assets seized, operatives captured, operations terminated. The man who'd wanted to rebuild his brother's empire using Connor's reputation had instead seen his own legacy reduced to ashes. But Richard Lawson represented a more complicated problem. The CIA director who'd betrayed Connor couldn't simply disappear without raising questions, and Connor needed him functional for the final phase of his plan. Instead, Connor had been feeding Lawson carefully selected intelligence about foreign operations, setting him up for a series of professional failures that would result in early retirement and disgrace. The mentor who'd sold out his protege would spend his remaining years watching his career's accomplishments crumble. The most difficult target, however, was Julia. Connor had moved out of their family home immediately after returning from the Adirondacks, taking up residence in a secure apartment near Langley. He provided financial support for the children, but had no direct contact with his wife beyond necessary legal communications. Julia had tried everything to repair their relationship: therapy sessions, letters, appeals through Tyler and Madison. But Connor's response was always the same: professional politeness coupled with absolute emotional detachment. "She's destroying herself, Dad," Tyler said during one of their weekly dinners. "She barely eats, barely sleeps. She keeps saying she'll do anything to fix this." Connor cut his steak with surgical precision. "Your mother had 18 years to talk to me about her concerns regarding my work. Instead, she chose to believe a stranger's lies and attempt to disappear with my children. That choice has consequences." "But people make mistakes," Madison argued. "She was manipulated by a professional." "She was manipulated because she wanted to be manipulated," Connor replied. "Morrison didn't create her doubts about me. He simply gave her permission to act on doubts she'd been harboring for years." The twins exchanged glances. At 16, they were old enough to understand the complexity of adult relationships, but young enough to hope their parents could somehow work through this crisis. "So what happens now?" Tyler asked. Connor set down his fork, studying his children's faces. They had their mother's eyes, but his stubborn determination. "Good. They'd need that strength for what came next. Now you learn one of life's most important lessons. Actions have consequences, and some consequences are permanent. Your mother chose to prioritize her fears over her family's safety. She chose to trust strangers over her husband. She chose to attempt removing you from my protection and placing you in mortal danger." "She didn't know," Madison started. "She didn't want to know," Connor corrected. "There's a difference. She had access to the truth, but chose to embrace comfortable lies instead." Connor pulled out a legal document and placed it on the table. "I'm filing for divorce. Full custody of both of you, with supervised visitation for your mother. The federal investigation has provided extensive documentation of her poor judgment and the danger her choices created." Both teenagers stared at the papers in shock. "Dad, you can't," Tyler began. "I can and I will. Your mother demonstrated that she cannot be trusted with your safety or our family's security. That won't happen again." "This is crazy." Madison's voice cracked with emotion. "You're destroying our family over a mistake." Connor's expression didn't change. "Your mother destroyed our family when she chose to believe I was a threat to my own children. I'm simply ensuring that her capacity for making such destructive choices is permanently limited." But that wasn't entirely true. Connor maintained passive surveillance on his ex-wife, not out of lingering affection, but from operational necessity. She remained a potential vector for enemies who might seek to use her against him or their children. What he discovered was a woman steadily deteriorating under the weight of her own choices. Julia had lost her teaching position due to the scandal surrounding her involvement with Morrison and the federal investigation. She'd moved back in with her parents, spending her days in therapy sessions that seemed to provide little relief from her guilt and regret. Her supervised visits with the twins had become exercises in mutual frustration. Julia couldn't understand why her children seemed to blame her more than Morrison or Volkov for their trauma, while Tyler and Madison couldn't understand why their mother refused to acknowledge the full scope of her betrayal. "She keeps acting like she was just another victim," Madison complained after one particularly difficult visit. "Like she had no choice but to believe Morrison's lies." "People who refuse to take responsibility for their choices rarely change those patterns," Connor replied. "Your mother has convinced herself that she was manipulated rather than admitting she chose to be manipulated." Tyler looked up from his homework. "So she'll keep making the same kinds of mistakes?" "Probably. People who blame external forces for their poor judgment rarely develop better judgment." It was a harsh assessment, but Connor had learned to value truth over comfort. His children would grow up understanding that choices had consequences, that trust was earned through consistent actions over time, and that forgiveness wasn't always possible or appropriate. As Tyler and Madison entered their final year of high school, Connor began planning their transition to adulthood. Both would attend college with full security details disguised as normal campus life. Both had been accepted to excellent schools based on their own academic merit. But most importantly, both understood that their father would always protect them, would never betray them, and would never forgive anyone who tried to harm them. Julia remained on the periphery of their lives, a cautionary tale about the consequences of choosing fear over trust, strangers over family, and comfortable lies over difficult truths. Connor felt no satisfaction in her destruction, but he felt no regret either. She had made her choices, and those choices had revealed who she truly was beneath the surface of their marriage. Some revelations, once made, could never be forgotten. Chapter 8. The Final Lesson. 2 years later, Connor received an encrypted message that would test everything he'd built since Julia's betrayal. The communication came through channels so secure that only a handful of people worldwide knew they existed. Priority Alpha. Julia McKenzie has been approached by Foreign Intelligence Service. Surveillance indicates potential recruitment attempt. Recommend immediate intervention. Source Blackbird. Connor stared at the message on his secure terminal, ice forming in his veins. Blackbird was his highest-level intelligence asset, someone whose information had never been wrong. If Julia was being targeted for recruitment, it meant someone had identified her as a potential source of intelligence about Connor's operations. Within hours, Connor had assembled a surveillance package that revealed the full scope of the threat. Chinese intelligence operatives had approached Julia through a support group for divorced military spouses, using the same psychological manipulation techniques Morrison had employed. The lead operative was Dr. Elena Chun, a psychiatrist who specialized in treating family members of classified personnel. Her approach was subtle, professional, and devastatingly effective. She was helping Julia process her trauma from being married to a government assassin, while gradually extracting details about Connor's methods, routines, and security protocols. Connor watched surveillance footage of Julia's therapy sessions with growing cold fury. His ex-wife was providing detailed information about their former home's security systems, Connor's travel patterns, his relationships with their children, and even specific conversations about his work that she'd overheard during their marriage. "She's giving them everything," Victor said, reviewing the intelligence package. Operational security, personal habits, psychological profile information. They're building comprehensive dossier on you through her cooperation. Is she doing it deliberately? Connor asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Hard to tell. Chun is very skilled at making it feel like therapy rather than debriefing. Julia probably thinks she's just processing her emotions, not realizing every detail is being cataloged for operational use. Connor studied the photographs of Julia leaving Chen's office, noting how much younger and more confident she looked. The Chinese psychologist was giving her what Morrison had provided: validation, understanding, and permission to view Connor as the villain in her story. But here's interesting part, Victor continued. Chen has also approached Tyler and Madison through their college counseling services. Separate operations, designed to look like normal student support services. Connor's hands clenched into fists. It was one thing for Julia to compromise his security through her own stupidity, but attempts to recruit his children crossed a line that would have deadly consequences. "Show me," he said quietly. The surveillance files revealed a sophisticated operation targeting both twins through their respective universities. Counselors with impeccable credentials were offering stress management services, academic support, and social integration assistance, all covers for intelligence gathering about their father's work and personal life. Tyler had already declined several offers of support, his training allowing him to recognize the manipulation attempts. But Madison, always more trusting than her brother, had attended 2 sessions with Dr. Sarah Kim at Georgetown before her instincts warned her something was wrong. They're trying to create a complete family picture, Connor realized. Julia for historical information, the twins for current operations and future planning. This goes beyond normal intelligence gathering, Victor observed. They're preparing for something bigger. Kidnapping, assassination, or blackmail operation that requires intimate knowledge of your personal life. Connor spent the next 72 hours developing a response that would permanently end the threat while providing a final education for his ex-wife about the consequences of her choices. The plan began with Connor accidentally allowing himself to be photographed at a location Chen's team was surveilling. The image showed him carrying what appeared to be classified documents, actually carefully prepared disinformation designed to trigger an accelerated recruitment attempt. As predicted, Chen immediately contacted Julia for an emergency session. Unknown to either woman, Connor had replaced Julia's therapist with one of his own assets, a deep-cover operative who'd spent years infiltrating foreign intelligence networks. The session was recorded from multiple angles as Chun dropped all pretense and directly asked Julia to obtain copies of Connor's work documents from his children during their next visit. This is your chance to finally be free of him, Chen explained, her professional mask slipping to reveal the predator beneath. The information you provide will help us neutralize his ability to hurt people like your family. Julia's response revealed everything Connor needed to know about her fundamental character. I can try, she said. Tyler and Madison still trust me sometimes. If I tell them, I need to see some of Connor's work to help with my therapy. Connor watched the recording with Victor, his expression never changing as his ex-wife agreed to actively betray their children for the promise of psychological relief from her guilt. She's not just compromised, Victor observed. She's actively choosing to become asset. She's choosing to believe the same comfortable lies someone else is telling her, Connor replied. Just like she did with Morrison. The operation's climax came when Julia attempted to manipulate Madison into providing intelligence about Connor's current work. The conversation took place in a restaurant Connor had selected, with surveillance equipment recording every word. Madison, honey, I need your help with something, Julia began, her voice carrying false warmth. My therapist thinks it would help me process my trauma if I could understand more about what your father actually does. Madison, now 19 and fully trained in recognizing manipulation, let her mother continue. Maybe you could show me some of his work materials? Just so I can understand the kind of stress our family was under. What kind of materials, Mom? Madison asked, her tone carefully neutral. Files, computers, anything that might help me make sense of why our marriage failed. Madison looked directly into her mother's eyes. You want me to steal intelligence from Dad and give it to you? Julia's face crumbled as she realized her daughter understood exactly what she was asking. It's not stealing, it's treason, Mom. Madison's voice carried the same cold certainty Connor had demonstrated during the Adirondack confrontation. You're asking me to betray my father to help you feel better about betraying him yourself. The conversation ended with Madison walking out, leaving Julia alone with the realization that she'd just attempted to turn her own daughter into an intelligence asset. Within 24 hours, Chun and her entire network were arrested by FBI counterintelligence teams acting on Connor's intelligence package. Julia found herself under federal investigation for espionage-related activities, facing potential prison time for her cooperation with foreign intelligence services. But Connor's real revenge was more sophisticated than criminal prosecution. Using his government connections, he arranged for Julia to understand exactly what her cooperation with Chun had nearly accomplished. She was shown intelligence assessments describing how the information she provided could have been used to target her children for kidnapping or assassination. She was allowed to read operational plans that detailed how Chinese intelligence intended to use her psychological profile to manipulate her into providing ongoing intelligence about Connor's work and personal life. Most devastating of all, she was shown recordings of Chun describing Julia as useful but ultimately disposable to her handlers in Beijing. Your mother has finally learned the real cost of choosing comfortable lies over difficult truths, Connor told Tyler and Madison after Julia's complete breakdown became public knowledge. She wanted to believe someone else was responsible for our family's problems, so badly that she was willing to betray her own children to maintain that illusion. Julia spent 3 months in federal psychiatric care before being released under permanent surveillance. She would never again have unsupervised contact with Connor's children, and any attempt to approach them would result in her immediate arrest. But the most fitting punishment was psychological. Julia now understood that her choices hadn't been the result of manipulation or victimization, but fundamental character flaws that made her a permanent security risk to everyone she claimed to love. She had become exactly what Morrison and Chun had always seen her as, a useful fool whose need for validation made her willing to betray anyone, including her own children, for the promise that someone else would take responsibility for her choices. Connor felt no satisfaction in her final destruction, but he felt profound relief. The woman who'd once shared his life and home would never again have the opportunity to threaten his children's safety through her weakness and poor judgment. Some people, he'd learned, simply couldn't be trusted with the things that mattered most. Chapter 9, Legacy. 5 years after Julia's final betrayal, Connor stood in the back of a university auditorium watching his son Tyler deliver the valedictorian speech at Georgetown Law School. Madison sat in the front row, having already completed her doctorate in international relations at Columbia, and now working for the State Department's counterintelligence division. Both of his children had chosen careers that reflected the lessons they'd learned about loyalty, betrayal, and the importance of protecting innocent people from those who would harm them. They understood the world's real dangers because they'd experienced manipulation and betrayal personally. Dad did something most parents never have to do, Tyler said during his speech, though the audience didn't understand the deeper meaning of his words. He showed us that love sometimes means making hard choices that protect the people you care about, even when those choices hurt everyone involved. Connor watched his children with quiet pride. They'd grown into adults who valued truth over comfort, competence over popularity, and loyalty over convenience. The trauma of their mother's betrayal had forged them into people who could be trusted with important responsibilities. After the ceremony, Connor took his children to dinner at a small restaurant he'd secured for the evening. No other patrons, comprehensive security, complete privacy for a family conversation that had been years in the making. "I have something to tell you both," Connor began, setting down his wine glass. "I'm retiring from active operations." Tyler and Madison exchanged glances. They'd known this day would come. Connor was 51, had served his country for over 2 decades, and had accomplished everything possible in his field. "What will you do?" Madison asked. "Train the next generation. Share what I've learned about identifying threats, protecting assets, and recognizing when people can and can't be trusted." Connor smiled slightly. "I've been asked to develop a new curriculum for intelligence operatives focused on personal security and family protection." "Because of what happened with Mom?" Tyler asked. "Because of what I learned from what happened with your mother. The importance of understanding that our enemies will always try to use our loved ones against us, and that sometimes the greatest threats come from people we trust most." Over the following months, Connor's plan unfolded with military precision. Julia's legal team was competent, but they were fighting against a man who'd spent decades learning how to destroy enemies systematically. Every aspect of her life during the Morrison affair was examined, documented, and presented as evidence of poor judgment and potential endangerment of the children. The federal investigation provided extensive documentation of how Julia's choices had nearly resulted in the deaths of both teenagers. Morrison's psychological manipulation was thoroughly detailed, but so was Julia's willingness to act on his suggestions without verification or discussion with Connor. Connor's own background was presented as an exemplary record of service to his country, with testimony from former colleagues about his dedication to protecting innocence. The contrast was devastating. Julia's supervised visitations were stilted, awkward affairs where she tried desperately to reconnect with children who increasingly saw her as the cause of their family's destruction. Tyler and Madison loved their mother, but they'd also learned to judge people by their actions rather than their intentions. "She made her choices," Tyler told a family court counselor during one session. "Dad's just making sure she can't make choices that dangerous for us again." Madison was more conflicted but equally clear about the betrayal's impact. "I love Mom, but I don't trust her judgment anymore. She was going to take us away from Dad because a stranger told her to. What if someone else tries to manipulate her again?" Connor attended every hearing, every counseling session, every legal proceeding with the same calm professionalism he brought to Black operations. He was never cruel to Julia, never raised his voice, never showed anything but respectful concern for the mother of his children. But he also never showed forgiveness, mercy, or any willingness to consider reconciliation. As the divorce proceedings concluded, Julia made one final desperate appeal. She cornered Connor outside the courthouse, tears streaming down her face. "Connor, please. I know I made terrible mistakes, but we can fix this. We can rebuild." "No," Connor replied simply. "We can't. You chose to believe I was a threat to our children. You chose to attempt removing them from my protection. You chose to trust enemies over family." He looked at her with the same dispassionate assessment he'd once reserved for targets. "Those choices revealed who you really are, Julia. And who you are is someone I can never trust again." As Connor walked away toward a future that included his children but would never again include their mother, Julia finally understood the true cost of her betrayal. Some bridges, once burned, could never be rebuilt. Some trust, once broken, could never be repaired. And some men, once betrayed, would never offer forgiveness, not even to the women they'd once loved more than life itself. Chapter 7. New foundations. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Connor purchased a large property in the Virginia countryside, complete with advanced security systems that rivaled those protecting government installations. The house was designed to be both a home for his children and a fortress against anyone who might threaten them again. Tyler and Madison had adapted to their new reality with remarkable resilience. The trauma of discovering their mother's manipulation had matured them in ways Connor found both impressive and heartbreaking. They understood now that the world contained people who would lie, manipulate, and betray even those they claimed to love. "Dad," Madison said one evening as they worked together in the garage on her car engine, "do you ever miss Mom?" Connor's hands stilled on the wrench he was holding. It was the first time either twin had asked him directly about his feelings toward their mother. "I miss the woman I thought she was," he replied honestly. "I miss the woman I believed I'd married. But that woman was apparently an illusion. But what if she really changes? What if she gets help and becomes?" "Madison," Connor's voice was gentle but firm, "your mother didn't make a mistake in judgment. She made a fundamental choice about who she trusted and who she feared. She chose to see her husband as a threat to her children. That's not something therapy can fix because it reveals something essential about her character." Tyler looked up from the motorcycle he was rebuilding. "You mean she'll always see you as dangerous?" "More than that. She'll always be susceptible to people who tell her what she wants to hear about me, about our family, about the choices we make." Connor resumed his work on the engine. Trust isn't just about believing someone won't lie to you. It's about believing they'll see reality clearly even when it's uncomfortable. The twins had limited contact with their mother during supervised visits, but those interactions had become increasingly strained. Julia seemed unable to accept that her children had moved on from her betrayal, that they'd learned to see her choices as fundamentally selfish rather than protective. During one particularly difficult visit, Julia had broken down completely, begging Tyler and Madison to understand that she'd only been trying to protect them. From Dad, Tyler had replied with the brutal honesty of a 17-year-old. "Mom, you try to protect us from the one person who's actually capable of protecting us. Do you understand how backwards that is?" Connor had built a different kind of family structure now, one based on absolute honesty rather than comfortable illusions. His children knew exactly what his work entailed, understood the risks and the reasons. They'd been trained in personal security, taught to recognize manipulation attempts, and educated about the realities of a world where people like Volkov existed. "We're not a normal family," Connor explained during one of their regular security briefings. "We can't afford to be. Normal families can survive members who make poor judgments or trust the wrong people. We can't, because the stakes are life and death." But Connor had also ensured that his children had access to normal experiences through carefully vetted connections. Sports teams, academic programs, social activities, all conducted under security protocols that were invisible but comprehensive. The twins' friends had no idea that Tyler and Madison's father was one of the government's most effective killers, or that their family business consultant lifestyle was cover for operations that shaped international relations. What their friends did notice was that Tyler and Madison were remarkably mature, self-possessed, and loyal to each other in ways that set them apart from typical teenagers. They'd learned to judge people by actions rather than words, to value capability over popularity, and to understand that real security came from competence rather than comfort. "Your children are impressive," Victor observed during one of his periodic security consultations. "They have your analytical skills, but without the emotional damage that created them." Connor nodded, watching Tyler help Madison with her calculus homework while simultaneously monitoring their property's security feeds. "They learned hard lessons early. Better than learning them too late." "And Julia?" Connor's expression didn't change. "Julia is no longer my concern." Connor had spent 5 years analyzing every aspect of Julia's betrayal, understanding how Morrison and Chun had exploited her psychological vulnerabilities, documenting the warning signs he'd missed. That analysis had become the foundation for new training protocols that would help other operatives protect their families from similar manipulation. "Your mother taught me something important," Connor continued. "Not through her loyalty, but through her disloyalty. She showed me that some people will always choose comfortable lies over difficult truths, will always blame others for their own poor choices, and will always be vulnerable to manipulation by people who tell them what they want to hear." Madison leaned forward. But she also showed us what real loyalty looks like, by contrast. Tyler and I learned to value truth and competence because we saw what happens when people choose weakness and self-deception instead. Tyler nodded agreement. We learned that trust has to be earned through consistent actions over time, not just promised through words or assumed through relationships. Connor studied his children's faces, seeing the strength and clarity that had emerged from their shared trauma. They would never be victims of the kind of manipulation that had destroyed their mother because they'd learned to recognize it early and reject it completely. There's something else, Connor said, pulling out 2 sealed envelopes. Your mother has been trying to contact you both through intermediaries. Letters, messages, even attempts to approach your friends and colleagues. Both twins' expressions hardened. They'd made it clear years ago that they had no interest in reconciling with the woman who tried to use them against their father. She wants to explain her choices, to help you understand that she was manipulated and deserves forgiveness, Connor continued. The decision about whether to read these letters is entirely yours. Tyler took his envelope and tore it into pieces without opening it. I already understand her choices. She chose fear over trust, strangers over family, and comfortable lies over difficult truths. There's nothing to explain and nothing to forgive. Madison held her envelope for several seconds before following her brother's example. She had multiple opportunities to choose our family over her own emotional comfort. She chose herself every time. That tells me everything I need to know about her character. Connor nodded, unsurprised by their responses. His children had learned to judge people by their actions rather than their intentions, and Julia's actions had spoken clearly for themselves. She's living in Florida now, Connor said. Remarried to a man who doesn't know about her history with foreign intelligence services. She's convinced herself that she was the victim in our story, that I was the real villain who destroyed our family through my work and my inability to forgive. Let her believe that, Tyler said. Some people need comfortable lies to survive. We've learned to value truth instead. As dinner concluded, Connor reflected on the strange gift Julia's betrayal had given his family. Her weakness had taught his children about strength. Her disloyalty had taught them about loyalty. Her willingness to trust enemies had taught them about the importance of careful judgment. What about you, Dad? Madison asked as they prepared to leave. Do you ever regret how things ended? Connor considered the question carefully. I regret that your mother was the kind of person who could be manipulated into betraying her own family. I regret that she never developed the strength to resist that manipulation. But I don't regret protecting you both from the consequences of her weakness. And you don't regret never forgiving her? Tyler asked. Forgiveness implies that someone has acknowledged their mistakes and taken steps to ensure they won't repeat them, Connor replied. Your mother has done neither. She's simply found new people to tell her comfortable lies about her choices. As they walked to their cars, Connor felt the satisfaction of a mission completed successfully. His children were strong, capable, and loyal. They understood the difference between truth and comfort, between love and manipulation, between people who could be trusted and people who couldn't. Julia had tried to destroy their family through her weakness and poor judgment. Instead, she'd forged it into something stronger than it had ever been before. Some betrayals, Connor had learned, revealed essential truths about character that could never be changed. His ex-wife would always be the kind of person who chose comfortable lies over difficult truths, who blamed others for her own choices, and who could be manipulated by anyone who told her what she wanted to hear. But his children would always be the kind of people who valued truth over comfort, loyalty over convenience, and strength over self-deception. In the end, that was Julia's true legacy, not the family she'd tried to destroy, but the stronger family her betrayal had created. Connor smiled as he watched Tyler and Madison drive away, knowing they would never make their mother's mistakes because they'd learned too early and too well what those mistakes could cost. Some lessons, he reflected, were worth any price to learn.